Affecting the quality of life and life expectancy. How much harm is being done by air pollution to the planet and its people? And are governments really doing enough for people to breathe easy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. From India, where cities have the worst air quality in the world, to China, where a documentary on smog has gone viral, and Europe, where there are dire warnings about premature deaths. Pollution, particularly air pollution, is proving a suffocating problem, you could say. Latest figures from Europe attributed more than 400,000 deaths to air pollution in 2011. And a new report from the European Environment Agency paints a bleak forecast, stating projected improvements in air quality are not expected to be sufficient to prevent continuing harm to health and the environment. In fact, out of 20 environmental trends identified by the agency, not one is expected to improve. When it comes to the world's worst cities for air quality, though, India is the biggest offender. According to the World Health Organization, it has 13 of the planet's 20 most polluted cities. Delhi tops the list, where pollution is said to be 6 times the levels considered safe. And a study in Mumbai estimates those levels would reduce life expectancy at birth by an average of 3 years.
Level of pollution in Delhi is definitely toxic. It is definitely bad. I am not going to get into whether Delhi is little better than Beijing or little worse than Beijing. We do not want to be ranked in the world in terms of how bad we are. I think what we need to accept is the level of pollution in Delhi is a public health emergency.
Probably pollution affects any and every organ of the body, but heart and the lungs are the two main problems. We see there is increased incidence of lung infections, bronchitis, and we get asthma kind of an attack, or even heart attacks and uncontrolled blood pressure. Those kind of ailments also increase during the winter months.
Well, China has been fighting back after years of criticism over the quality of its air, going so far as to declare war on pollution at last year's National People's Congress, and subsequently bringing in a law which subjects polluters to unlimited fines. Well, even so, a provocative video released this week blaming corporate greed and a lack of political will to tackle pollution has gone viral in China, racking up more than 3 million hits. Let's get the thoughts of our guests now on this issue, which of course affects billions of people right across the world. In Goa, Sarath Gutikunda, founder and director of Urban Emissions. Joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao, chairman of the China Energy Security Institute. And completing our panel in Brussels, we have Joris den Blanken, EU Climate Policy Director at Greenpeace. Good to have you with us. If I could start with Sarath. It's really shocking when you read some of the numbers, isn't it, Sarath? According to the WHO, as we said there, India's got 13 of the top 20 polluted cities in the world. But perhaps what's even more surprising is that most cities don't even have proper monitoring equipment to measure what's going on in the air. Why?
And that's always been one of the bottlenecks in some of the information that's coming out of the monitoring networks in India. So if this information was a lot more continuous and a lot more credible, the notes that we are looking at in terms of comparison, that will be a lot more credible. So until then, I think we have to stop at the fact that the pollution in Delhi and many other cities is equally bad. and probably as bad as some of the cities in China. I think it's not just we don't have enough information on how bad or how much is this air pollution. I think that till then, the comparisons are always intermittent.
Well, since we're talking about measuring air pollution, it is measured by what's termed fine particulate matter, technically known by the boring acronym PM2.5. Now, these are particles or droplets in the air that can reduce visibility as well as stick in people's lungs and cause disease. Using this measurement, the World Health Organization's maximum healthy exposure is supposed to be 25. Last year in northern China, for example, readings of 500 micrograms per cubic meter were recorded. That's 20 times the safe limit. As we mentioned, Delhi's average readings now 153, more than 6 times safe levels. Much of Europe is within the WHO's safe threshold, but some areas in Italy and Eastern Europe, for example, have seen readings in excess of 30 on this scale. Very worrying situation. Joris, even in Europe where you have a measuring infrastructure, there are problems, and there are claims that 400,000 people have died prematurely because of breathing toxic fumes. How on earth is this happening?
Yeah, air pollution remains a very severe problem in Europe, and we see in particular that older people, young people suffer most from lung problems, heart problems. And when you look at who's responsible for this, it's a variety of sectors, transport emissions, residential emissions. But the biggest source, for example, of mercury emissions, toxic mercury emissions and sulfur dioxide emissions are coal combustion in coal plants. And although coal consumption is decreasing since the 1990s in Europe, this remains a big problem. For example, dust emissions from coal are going up. And this is causing air pollution in Europe is causing a major economic damage and major damage for health and environment.
I want to talk about coal more in a second, but if we could bring Victor into the discussion, focusing on the issue of measuring. By the beginning of 2013, Victor, as I'm sure you know, authorities in China had set up around 500 of these so-called PM2.5 stations in over 70 cities. And you think, okay, that's great progress. But then you listen to officials like the Deputy Minister of Environmental Protection, who says we need and will build another 1,500 stations. That just those numbers give you an idea of the scale of the challenge that China faces in just knowing how big the problem is.
Yes, indeed. I would say pollution in China now is recognized as one of the nemesis for the health of the people as well as for the sustainability of the economic development in China. And the pollution is not only air pollution, but also includes water pollution, underground water pollution, and soil pollution. Now, for the air pollution, I think everyone can see it, and everyone is concerned. Water pollution, most people do not see it. And once they realize that water is polluted, it may be a little bit too late. Soil pollution, really, it takes great experts to understand what's going on in the soil pollution sector. Most people have no access to the problem, and also they do not have the knowledge base to understand how it is happening. But all combined together, air pollution, soil pollution, and water pollution really become a very serious problem. And I think there is increasing demand among the people, among the regulators, the government agencies, as well as corporates to do something. But I think at this particular moment, we still talk a lot about these talks, but we still do not know what to do. And the government has not done a very good job in mobilizing all the resources in China and in mobilizing the people throughout the country in all walks of life to really put in all the efforts to fight against pollution. So I think we still need to make this big leap of faith from talking the right talk, which we talk a lot about that these days in China, to doing the right thing, to walk the right walk in this very important campaign against pollution.
All right, so talking the talk and walking the walk often brings you up against powerful vested interests, brings you in the face of bribery, corruption. Sarath, even when pollution is monitored, we're told corruption in India can mean data can be manipulated, fudged or hidden. The Badapur power plant, perhaps a good example of this.
So information has always been the bottleneck, and since the data is not in the open domain, it brings out a lot of these opportunities to hide the data or manipulate the data. And it is not just at the industrial level, but it's also seen at the ambient monitoring stations as well. And the stations are exceeding. We do see situations where stations are moved, so the numbers come down. And these manipulations happen all the time. So the only way to go around this is to have more and more information, more and more monitoring stations which are in the public domain, so that everybody has access to it and have the opportunity to scrutinize them.
Victor Gao, perhaps also part of the problem lies in the system of the balance of power between local authorities and central government when it comes to China. Local authorities, we're told, have more actually of an incentive to turn a blind eye to polluters because they provide jobs, they provide money for the local area. How can we expect, for example, a point which was made by the Chinese documentary maker Chai Jing, who interviews local officials who are supposed to be, protecting the environment, but they say, one man is quoted as saying, well, I don't want to open my mouth because I'm afraid you'll see that I'm toothless. If he's getting his money and his salary from the local authority, and the local authority has an interest in keeping polluting factories working, there's something wrong with this system, isn't there, Victor?
Yeah, I would say for many years, in China at least, there is this great debate basically saying that you either want to have great economic development at the expense of environment, or you may want to achieve great environmental protection at the expense of economic development. It's this kind of either or kind of a development versus environmental protection being pitched against each other, being antagonistic with each other. And you have to choose one, either growth without environmental protection or environmental protection at a huge cost to economic development. I think we as a nation in China need to make a transformation. We need to break out from this kind of irresponsible kind of splitting the hair.
Is that in fact happening, Victor? Forgive me for interrupting you. Are we seeing something of that transition happening now? Talk to us a little bit about the reaction that we've been seeing in China to this documentary made by Chai Jing, all about the pollution. It's really gone viral, hasn't it?
Yeah, the documentary, I think, exposed a lot of these problems, but I think the conclusion is exactly in the type of this either or. She's basically saying we need to have better environmental protection even at the cost of economic development. I think we need to come up with a better paradigm, and I think it takes a lot of work, a lot of lobbying to promote this. That is, we actually can come up with a new paradigm of green development. That is, you can actually achieve high economic growth rate while protecting environmental considerations. That means green development is not a cost in itself. If you protect the environment, you can actually make money out of that. If we go for sustainable development, for example, green technologies, etc., eventually that itself adds to the GDP growth. On top of that, it may actually also alleviate the problems on the pollution side. So this kind of a green development, I hope, will eventually be not only the hard truth in China, but also the soft truth and the smart truth. It takes a lot of work, of course, I admit that, and also a lot of education. But eventually, I think we can have this new paradigm of rapid economic development while still protecting the environment. And green development, I think, in my best judgment, is the only right way forward for China.
There's a lot to say when it comes to the issue of development versus pollution, isn't there? But let me go to Joris first before we go into more on development. Standards being watered down, even in Europe, when we talk about enforcement of rules. Your organization talks about standards being watered down by industry lobbyists. Tell us more about that. How is that leaving Europe less of a safe place to breathe?
Yes, Greenpeace released an investigation this week assessing what is going on with new power plant pollution standards. And we concluded that actually the standards currently considered by EU decision makers are weaker than those that are already in place in Japan, in China, in the United States. And we also have assessed how this decision-making process works. The standards should be agreed later this year, but actually many EU governments have selected industry representatives, so people on the payroll of the coal industry, to represent their country and to make public policies. So that results basically in the coal industry regulating itself. So it doesn't come as a surprise that those pollution standards being considered are very, very weak and harmful for health and environment.
It's quite shocking. In fact, one of the stats which I looked at, Joris, the UK, for example, according to the EEA, the European Environment Agency, saying the UK has been one of the worst offenders, and government figures showing that European Union regulations on air quality will not be met in cities including London, Birmingham and Leeds until 2030.
Yes, there's a very concerning situation. The UK is one example, but also when we look, for example, to a country like Greece, 7 of the 7 Greek government representatives in this decision-making process are from the largest power company in the country. But also in countries like Poland, Germany, there are government representatives who are actually on industry payroll, defining the best available technology standards and emission standards for coal-fired power plants. So we see, for example, that for some of the harmful emissions, the European standards could be 80% or 30% weaker than the standards in place in the big provinces, the key economic provinces in China.
Victor, talking of China, Victor, I want to come back to a point you mentioned and finding the balance between development and environment. One study noted 70% of China's energy needs comes from coal, coal being one of the big polluters of the air quality. And official policy is going towards increasing the number of coal plants. It's expected to double energy consumption from coal by the year 2020. It begs the question, is it possible to balance development? What is the paradigm you were talking about? One can have both development and breathe easy.
No, I would say my information is just the contrary. I think coal used to be almost at about 80% of the energy mix. Last year it was at about 68%, and I think the immediate goal is to bring coal down from 68% to about 65% and eventually down to 60% as a percentage in the overall energy mixture in China. Now, on the other hand, coal has and will remain an important energy source, mainly because China has one of the largest coal reserves in the world. And China is short on natural resources, especially like crude oil as well as natural gas. And I think in the best estimate, coal will remain way above 50% for many years to come in China now.
So isn't that a problem, Victor?
There has been a lot of effort tapping into the natural gas. Pardon me?
Isn't that a problem, especially when you take into consideration, even
Yes.
when Beijing brings out regulations like installing scrubbers into the new coal plants to make sure that they're, environmentally safe. According to, for example, Elizabeth Economy in The River Runs Black, she notes how many of these scrubbers will be installed but not actually operated to keep costs down.
Yeah. Absolutely. As I mentioned, coal will remain an important source of energy in China for many years to come, but we need to reduce the coal as a percentage of the energy mix. And also, I think we need to introduce clean coal technology so that the coal that we will use, mostly generating power, will become cleaner in the whole process. The best way to do this juggling is to increase the percentage of natural gas in the energy mixture. Last year it's only about 6%, way low, too low compared with all the other major economies in the world. In many developed countries, natural gas would account for about 25 or even 30% of the energy mix. So that means China will need to line up major supplies of natural gas domestically, but also internationally in the coming years. And this is mainly to reduce coal as a percentage of the energy mixture. But further, I would say, equally, if even more importantly, we need to come up with better ways, mostly renewable resources like hydro and also new sources of energy like solar and wind. I think China by now is already the largest new and renewable sources of energy producers. And I think it just needs to take a lot of more courage and wisdom in China to make sure that the solar panels, the wind turbines, etc., that we produce at high capacity will also be used very extensively in China.
Right.
And eventually,
no
I
doubt,
think we
no
will
doubt
have
it
a
will
better
take
energy mixture.
a lot more courage. I think that's something everyone can agree on. Sarath, the argument has also often been presented by officials in India as one of development versus the environment, that any objections to India's pollution situation is simply a smokescreen, no pun intended, to try and upset India's economic growth by countries which are jealous of it. Is that paradigm changing? Is that narrative changing?
That's definitely changing. If you look at the recent financial budget that was released last week, there was a direct allocation for developing 100 gigawatts of solar power that are likely to come online by 2020. They've also allocated budget for building 4 ultra-critical coal-fired power plants, 4,000 megawatts each. So when we say ultra-critical power plants, these will be at least 2 or 3 times more efficient than which are operating right now. So they won't come online in 2 years or 3 years, but they'll come online in 10 years for sure. So this is part of the development, but we are trying to make sure that the development is happening with technological advances put into place. So as Victor mentioned, they can go both hand in hand. We do want to make sure that every household has electricity for 24 hours of the day, and that is only possible if enough power is generated. And right now, coal is still the primary source of energy, and that will still remain there. But there are programs in place to make sure that it's going to be burnt cleaner, and regulations are being introduced. Just last year, the environmental standard for the PM pollution from the coal-fired power plants was dropped 3 times from what it was earlier. So, which means that the realization is happening even in the ministries, so that we move with the trend. So these things take time to come into effect, but we are seeing some of the changes happening in smaller cities immediately. And for example, take Delhi itself. When it's in the discussions quite a bit, but
right.
Most of the power plants that are operating within the city, they're not coal-based. Now they're natural gas-based.
All right, sorry to interrupt you, Sarath. Since we've just got a little over a minute, I want to ask Yaris a final thought on the problem, perhaps, of policy in European countries. We're told there is a lack of holistic approach to environmental issues, where there may be emphasis, for example, EU countries try and encourage people to use diesel engines for their cars that cause less greenhouse gas emissions, but cause more problems with particulate matter pollution in the air. Is there a problem in putting all the pieces of environmental policy together in Europe?
Yeah, what is missing is a decisive vision on moving towards a fully clean energy economy. There are problems with air pollution. Europe has a major problem with costly imports of fossil fuels. We're wasting every day 1 billion euros on fossil fuel imports. So both for the economy, for our health, for the environment, it's required to change the economy to a clean, sustainable, low-carbon economy. And coal doesn't have a role to play in there. But this vision is currently lacking. And European leaders, but of course also the leaders in India, in China, and the US, they need to take leadership to provide that vision. And to make policies that benefit the public and in the end also our economy.
All right, leadership and vision, a theme and a thought I think we can all agree on. Let's thank our guests in Goa, Sarath Gutikunda, in Beijing, Victor Gao, and in Brussels, Joris Den Blanken. And thank you for joining us. If you've got anything you'd like to add, go over to our programme page at aljazeera.com, and you can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or send us your tweets to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Sami Zaidan. From the whole team for now, it's goodbye.